The scent of brewed coffee and freshly baked pie filled the air as Clara wiped the same counter she had polished every morning for 10 years. The diner was her world, small and warm, with neon lights that hummed like a heartbeat in the quiet town. To her, Mr. Lee, the owner, was more than a boss. He was family, or so she thought. But when a stranger walked in one rainy afternoon and stared at her as if seeing a ghost, something deep inside her stirred. In that fleeting glance, Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, unaware that the truth she had searched for her whole life was hidden in the hands that once taught her how to make perfect coffee. The morning sunlight slipped through the tall diner windows, spreading warmth across the polished counter where Clara moved with quiet precision. Her hands worked automatically, flipping cups upright, wiping away invisible dust, aligning silverware as though order itself could keep her heart from wandering. The place was already humming with the soft rhythm of early chatter, the clinking of spoons against porcelain, the hiss of coffee brewing behind her. "Morning, Clara," called old Mr. Jenkins from his usual booth, his voice as raspy as the vinyl stool he sat on every day. She smiled, the kind of smile that made people believe she was happy, and poured his coffee just the way he liked it, black, with 1 sugar stirred exactly 3 times. He had once told her that it made it taste like home. For Clara, home had always been a word that floated just beyond reach, something she built in fragments between shifts and lonely evenings in her small apartment above the diner. As she glanced at the window, the reflection staring back at her felt like a stranger wearing her face, someone who belonged here only because no one had ever asked her to leave. The radio played softly from the kitchen, an old song about dreams and time, muffled by the sound of frying bacon. Mr. Lee's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm, reminding the young cook to mind the heat. He always sounded the same, steady and certain, as though nothing in the world could surprise him any more. When his eyes met Clara's through the pass window, he smiled faintly and mouthed, "You okay?" She nodded, pretending not to feel the sting of sudden emotion that came with such a simple question. He had been the one constant in her life since she was 17, the man who had given her a job when she had nowhere else to go. She owed him more than she could ever say, though sometimes she wondered why he had helped her so easily. He treated her like family, yet there were moments, tiny, fleeting ones, when he looked at her with a sadness that didn't belong in his eyes. The diner clock ticked softly above the counter, marking another morning that felt just like the last. The rhythm of routine soothed her, made her believe that as long as she kept smiling, kept moving, kept the coffee hot and the plates full, life would stay simple. But simplicity had its own silence, and in that silence her thoughts often drifted toward the questions she never asked: who her real family was, why her past felt like a puzzle with missing corners, and why Mr. Lee always looked away when the subject of parents came up. Outside, the street was beginning to wake, sunlight bouncing off windshields, a delivery truck pulling up with its usual screech. The bell above the door jingled softly as a new customer entered, and Clara turned instinctively with her welcoming smile, ready to start another day in the only world she had ever known, unaware that this morning would be the last ordinary one she would ever have. Mr. Lee stood behind the pass window, his sleeves rolled up neatly as he arranged plates with practiced care, the same way he had done every morning for as long as Clara could remember. The steam rising from the griddle softened his features, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful, following Clara as she moved from table to table with her usual grace. He had always been protective, sometimes overly so, insisting on walking her home at night, reminding her to keep the diner door locked even when she was alone during slow hours. At first, she thought it was just kindness, the concern of an old man who had taken a fatherly liking to the girl he once rescued from a bad situation. But lately, there was something else in his tone, a quiet tension that made her feel like there were things left unsaid between them. He watched her laugh with the regulars, her soft voice filling the air with warmth, and though he smiled in return, his expression carried the weight of someone who had already lived through loss. Clara noticed it too, the flicker of sadness that crossed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her rhythm, the steady comfort of the morning routine. "You should sit down for a minute," Mr. Lee called from behind the counter. "You've been running around since sunrise." She smiled and shook her head, pretending not to hear the hint of worry in his voice. "I'm fine," she said gently. "You know I like keeping busy." He nodded, but his hands froze for a second, hovering over the counter as if he wanted to say something more. Then, as always, he changed the subject, calling out an order to the kitchen and disappearing into the back. The diner buzzed with easy chatter, the kind that felt like music to Clara's ears. But somewhere beneath the noise, she felt the pull of curiosity she could never quite silence. Why did Mr. Lee look at her like she was fragile glass? Why did he flinch every time she mentioned her childhood or her lack of family? Once she had teased him about being her honorary father, and he had smiled, but the smile hadn't reached his eyes. Now, as she refilled cups and wiped down tables, she found herself thinking about the early days when she first started here, how he had hired her on the spot without even asking for references, how he had insisted she live in the small apartment upstairs so she wouldn't have to commute. It had seemed generous then, almost miraculous, but as she glanced at him now, busy pretending not to watch her, a strange unease brushed her heart. It felt as if the safety she had found here was built on something fragile, something that might crumble if she looked too closely. Outside, the light grew brighter, spilling across the window seats and turning the chrome edges into mirrors. The world looked golden, peaceful, exactly as it always had. Yet for the first time, Clara felt the faint stirring of a question she could not name, a whisper in the back of her mind that told her the man who cared for her like a father was guarding a truth too heavy to speak. The bell above the diner door chimed softly, letting in a gust of cool afternoon air and the faint scent of rain. Clara looked up from the counter, cloth in hand, as a stranger stepped inside. His coat was soaked, water dripping from the hem, but it wasn't the weather that caught her attention. It was the way he froze when he saw her, as if he had walked into a memory he wasn't expecting to find. Their eyes met, and for a brief, unsettling moment, time seemed to pause. The diner's familiar noise faded into a soft hum as she felt something in his stare that tugged at a place deep inside her chest, a place she didn't even know existed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice light but uncertain. The man blinked, struggling to speak, then finally nodded. "Just coffee," he said quietly, his tone too careful, too measured. She poured it and set the cup before him, noticing the tremor in his hand as he reached for it. From behind the counter, Mr. Lee's voice came sharp and steady. "Everything all right, Clara?" She turned toward him, surprised at the edge in his tone. Mr. Lee never sounded like that. His gaze was fixed on the stranger, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed in a way she had never seen before. "Yes," she said quickly, glancing between them. "He just came in for coffee." The stranger's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Lee stepped out from behind the counter, his movements slow but deliberate. "You passing through?" he asked the man, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Just stopped for a break," the man replied, sipping the coffee without looking away from Clara. The silence that followed was thin and heavy, stretching across the small diner like a wire pulled too tight. Clara forced a polite smile and went back to wiping tables, though her hands trembled slightly. She could feel both of them watching her, the stranger with something unreadable in his eyes, Mr. Lee with barely contained unease. After a few minutes, the man stood up, left some bills on the counter, and nodded once before leaving. The bell rang again, and the sound felt sharper than before, echoing in the space he left behind. Clara turned to Mr. Lee. "You know him?" she asked softly. Mr. Lee's expression didn't change, but his answer came too fast. "No, never seen him before." She frowned. "He looked at me like he knew me." Mr. Lee avoided her gaze, retreating toward the kitchen. "People look all kinds of ways," he muttered, his voice low. "Don't think too much of it." Clara watched him disappear behind the swinging door, her heartbeat uneven. She glanced out the window just in time to see the stranger pause at the corner, looking back once before vanishing into the rain. Something about that look made her breath hitch. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. And though she couldn't explain why, a chill ran through her as she realized that whatever had just happened was not an accident. Clara tried to shake off the strange feeling that clung to her after the man left, but it lingered like the smell of rain on the floor tiles. The diner was quiet now, the afternoon lull wrapping everything in a fragile calm. She stood by the counter, pretending to rearrange sugar packets while her mind replayed every detail of the encounter. The look in the stranger's eyes, the hesitation in his voice, the way Mr. Lee's tone had shifted from warmth to warning in a heartbeat. It all felt wrong. "You're quiet today," said Mrs. Porter, a regular who came in every afternoon for lemon pie and tea. Clara forced a smile and poured her another cup, murmuring something about being tired. Mrs. Porter nodded kindly and went back to her crossword, unaware that Clara's thoughts were miles away. Through the pass window, she could see Mr. Lee moving with rigid precision, cleaning the grill that was already spotless, his back turned to her. The air between them had changed. It was as though an invisible thread had been pulled too tight, and now every sound felt sharper, every silence heavier. Clara finally took a deep breath and approached him. "Are you sure you don't know that man?" she asked softly. Mr. Lee froze for half a second, then resumed scrubbing. "I told you, Clara. Just a stranger passing through." She hesitated. "He looked at me like he knew me." Mr. Lee's voice came out flat, quiet but firm. "People see what they want to see. Best not to think too much on it." She wanted to believe him, she always did, but something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't irritation, it was fear. Real fear, the kind that doesn't belong in a man who never seemed rattled by anything. She watched him closely, searching his face for answers he wouldn't give. "All right," she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. "I guess I'm just being silly." He turned then, his eyes softer now, his voice almost pleading. "You've got a good heart, Clara. Don't let strangers mess with it." The words hung between them, gentle but loaded. She nodded, swallowing the questions that rose in her throat, and went back to wiping the counter. The hours crawled by. The rain outside slowed to a mist, painting the windows with silver streaks. The diner lights flickered once, then steadied. A truck rumbled past on the empty road, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw someone standing across the street, watching the diner. When she blinked, the figure was gone. She shook her head and laughed under her breath, but it wasn't real laughter. It was the sound of someone trying to calm the storm inside. Mr. Lee emerged from the kitchen, locking eyes with her as if he sensed what she was thinking. "Go home early tonight," he said quietly. "I'll close up." Clara frowned. "But it's barely evening." He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've done enough for today." There was no point arguing. She hung up her apron, grabbed her coat, and stepped outside. The air was damp and cool, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled faintly. As she turned to look back through the diner window, she saw Mr. Lee still standing behind the counter, staring at the door long after it closed. His hand rested on the edge of the register, his posture rigid, his face drawn tight with worry. Whatever secret he was keeping, it was beginning to crack. And Clara, though she didn't yet understand why, felt that everything safe and familiar in her world had just shifted, if only by an inch. That evening the diner glowed under the dull hum of its neon lights, the kind of glow that softened everything but could not quite hide the unease simmering beneath the surface. Clara stayed late to close, the air thick with the scent of coffee and rain. She moved slowly, her mind circling back to the stranger who had stared at her like she was someone from another life. The booths were empty now, crumbs scattered across tabletops, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock above the door. As she wiped the last counter, something caught her eye. A folded piece of paper sat near the napkin holder, half hidden beneath an empty mug. She frowned, certain it had not been there earlier. Setting down the cloth, she picked it up carefully. It was a receipt, the kind she gave with every order, but someone had written on the back in hurried pen strokes 4 words. "Ask him about Rose." Her stomach tightened. The letters were smudged slightly, as though written in haste, but clear enough to make her pulse quicken. Rose. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once, as if it belonged to a dream she could not quite recall. She turned toward the kitchen, half expecting Mr. Lee to appear, but the doorway was empty. The sound of the clock grew louder. She read the message again, her heart pounding with questions she could not yet form. Who was Rose? What did the stranger mean? Why had he left this note for her, and not just walked away without a word? She looked toward the door, as though he might still be standing there in the rain, waiting for her to follow. But the street outside was empty. Dark except for the flicker of the street lamp across the road. A chill crept down her spine. She slipped the note into her pocket and finished cleaning, her movements mechanical, her thoughts spinning in quiet chaos. When she finally turned off the lights, the diner fell into shadow, and the reflection in the window caught her off guard. For a second, she thought she saw another face beside her own, faint and pale, but when she blinked, it was gone. Shaking off the feeling, she locked the door and stepped into the damp night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement glistening under the streetlights. She walked slowly toward her apartment above the diner, one hand in her pocket, clutching the small folded paper. The name echoed in her mind with every step. Rose. The sound of it stirred something buried deep inside her, something she had never dared to touch. Maybe it was a memory, maybe just a longing. As she reached her door, she hesitated, glancing back down at the darkened diner below. A question pressed at her chest, sharp and certain. What could Mr. Lee possibly be hiding that a stranger would risk warning her about it? She looked up at the sky, heavy with clouds, and whispered the name under her breath. Rose. The word felt like the beginning of something she could not yet see, a thread pulling her toward a truth that had been waiting patiently for years to be found. That night Clara could not sleep. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled her small apartment, mingling with the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. She sat at her kitchen table, the note spread out before her, its edges damp from where she had unfolded and refolded it too many times. The handwriting was jagged, uncertain, as if written by someone who feared being seen. "Ask him about Rose." She whispered the words aloud, tasting them like a secret. The name echoed in the quiet room, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. She tried to picture the stranger again, the way he had looked at her, eyes full of recognition and sadness, and the way Mr. Lee's face had gone pale in that instant. Questions circled her mind like restless birds. Who was Rose? Why would Mr. Lee lie about knowing that man? And why did her chest ache every time she said the name? She rubbed her temples, remembering the bits of her childhood that never made sense. The nameless faces in her dreams, the lullaby she sometimes hummed without remembering where she learned it, the sense that her life had begun halfway through a story someone else had already written. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. She made tea she did not drink and stared at the photo she kept pinned to the fridge, a picture of herself at 17, smiling in her diner uniform, Mr. Lee standing proudly beside her. For years, she had told herself he was the closest thing to family she would ever have. He had given her work, shelter, kindness, but now, staring at that photo, she saw something she had never noticed before, the way his arm held her protectively, almost possessively, the shadow of worry etched into his eyes even as he smiled. It was not just affection, it was fear. A soft rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Clara folded the note again and tucked it into her locket, the one she had worn since childhood without knowing where it came from. She had found it in a box of clothes left by the orphanage, engraved with a single letter on the back. Ah. She had always assumed it stood for her own name. Now she wondered if it stood for something else. Or someone else. She moved to the window and looked down at the empty street below. The diner sat dark and silent, the neon sign still buzzing faintly in the rain. A single light glowed in the back room, and she realized Mr. Lee was still there. It was nearly 2 a.m, and he had not gone home. Her breath caught as she saw his silhouette through the curtain. He was sitting at the counter, his hands covering his face, shoulders shaking as if from silent sobs. For the first time since she had known him, he looked small, human, broken. Clara stepped back from the window, her pulse quickening. Whatever secret bound them together was alive and heavy, pressing between the walls of that diner. She did not yet understand what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. The name Rose was not just a message, it was the beginning of the truth. The next morning the sun rose pale and uncertain, its light struggling to break through the grey clouds that still hung low over the small town. Clara dressed slowly, her mind restless from a night without sleep. Every sound from the diner below seemed sharper, clearer, as though her world had shifted slightly out of place. When she walked in, the familiar scent of coffee and warm bread should have comforted her, but instead it made her chest tighten. Mr. Lee was already behind the counter, moving with his usual efficiency, his back turned to her. "Morning," she said softly. He looked up, startled for a brief second before forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're in early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. Her voice sounded thinner than usual, like a note played on a cracked instrument. She reached for her apron, tying it carefully, watching him from the corner of her eye. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on stacking cups, his movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Lee," she began, her tone calm but steady, "can I ask you something?" He froze, then nodded slowly. "Of course, Clara. What is it?" She hesitated, then took the small folded receipt from her pocket and laid it on the counter between them. "Do you know anyone named Rose?" The question seemed to drain the color from his face. His hands trembled just slightly as he reached for a towel to wipe the counter that was already spotless. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked quietly. "A customer left this," she said. "Yesterday. The man you told me not to worry about." Mr. Lee's eyes flickered, a moment of panic breaking through his calm expression. He looked away. "People leave strange things behind," he said finally, his voice tight. "Don't let it bother you." Clara frowned. "It's just the way you reacted when you saw him. It felt like you knew something, like maybe he wasn't a stranger after all." He set down the towel and looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "Clara, there are some things better left alone," he said softly. "Sometimes digging into the past only brings pain." "Maybe," she whispered, "but pain doesn't scare me. Lies do." The words hung in the air, fragile but heavy. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then Mr. Lee sighed and turned away, muttering something about checking the supplies in the back. Clara stood there, the receipt still on the counter, feeling a strange mix of guilt and defiance. She had never spoken to him that way before, and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. Yet, deep down, she knew the silence between them could not last. Something was unraveling, and no matter how tightly he tried to hold it together, the truth was slipping through his fingers. As she returned to her routine, pouring coffee and taking orders, she could feel his eyes on her from the kitchen doorway, full of worry and something else she couldn't name. It wasn't anger, it was sorrow, and that frightened her more than anything he could have said. Clara waited until the last customer left that evening, the fading sunlight casting long, golden stripes across the diner floor. The bell above the door gave one final ring before silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. She told Mr. Lee she would handle closing and watched as he hesitated before nodding. "Don't stay too late," he said, his tone firm but weary. She smiled faintly. "I won't." But as soon as his car pulled out of the lot, her heart began to race. The questions she had carried all day pressed harder now, and the quiet offered no comfort. She moved to the back hallway where the door to the storage room stood half open, its hinges creaking softly as she pushed it wider. The smell of dust and old paper hit her like a memory. Stacks of ledgers, boxes of receipts, and forgotten decorations filled the small space. A single bulb flickered overhead, throwing weak light across the clutter. She stepped carefully between the boxes, her fingers brushing over worn labels marked with faded dates. For years she had thought this room was just a graveyard of diner history, but now it felt like something more. Somewhere in this space, she felt sure, was the truth she had been circling her whole life without knowing it. She found an old tin box near the back, its lid rusted and bent at one corner. It took effort to pry it open, and when she finally did, a small puff of dust rose into the air. Inside were photos, newspaper clippings, and letters tied with a thin ribbon that had long since lost its color. Her pulse quickened as she lifted the bundle out, her hands trembling. The first photo she pulled free showed a younger version of Mr. Lee, smiling proudly beside a woman with soft eyes and a kind face. Clara froze. The woman looked like her, not just a resemblance. The same eyes, the same curve of the mouth, the same shape of the chin. Her breath caught as she flipped the photo over. Written in looping ink were the words, "Opening day for Rose." She stared at the name, her thoughts spinning faster than she could control. Rose, the woman who haunted her dreams, the name the stranger had left her. She sank to the floor, the picture trembling in her grip, her mind refusing to connect the pieces even as they began to fit together. Why had Mr. Lee kept this? Why had he never told her? A noise in the hallway made her jump. She froze, holding her breath, listening. Nothing but the distant hum of the freezer. Still, the air felt heavier now, as though the diner itself was aware of what she had found. She tucked the photo into her pocket, replaced the box, and turned off the light. As she stepped into the main room again, she glanced around at the familiar space that had been her home for so long. Every booth, every plate, every corner now looked different, like part of a story she had never been told. She locked up quickly and climbed the stairs to her apartment, her heart pounding in her ears. Once inside, she leaned against the door and pulled out the photograph again, tracing her finger over the woman's face. "Who are you?" she whispered into the stillness. The answer, she felt, was closer than ever, waiting for her in the lies that Mr. Lee could no longer hide. Clara sat at her small kitchen table long after midnight, the photo lying before her beneath the dim yellow light. The woman in the picture stared back with that soft smile, a smile so familiar it made her chest ache. She could not stop studying it, tracing the details again and again, as if repetition might unlock something hidden in her memory. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the face, the gentle eyes, the small dimple that appeared when she smiled, and standing beside her in the photo, younger but unmistakable, was Mr. Lee. The two looked proud and happy, the kind of happiness that belonged to people who shared something more than friendship. On the back, those 5 simple words still caught her breath every time she read them. Opening day for Rose. The diner had been dedicated to her, a name she had never once heard in all her years there, a name whispered to her by a stranger, a name that felt like it belonged to her somehow. Clara's thoughts tumbled over each other until she could hardly breathe. If Rose was the woman in the picture, and Mr. Lee had kept it hidden, then who exactly was she to him? Her fingers brushed over the faded ink, feeling the grooves where the pen had pressed deep into the paper. She remembered the note she had found and the letter engraved on her locket. It was no longer a coincidence. Slowly she rose from the table and crossed the room to the small box where she kept her keepsakes. Inside were fragments of her life before the diner, a bracelet from the foster home, a few documents from social services, an old blanket with floral embroidery, nothing that told her where she truly came from. She held the photo up beside her reflection in the window. The resemblance was sharper now in the faint light. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She needed answers, and only one person could give them. Her mind replayed Mr. Lee's voice from earlier that day, the way he had said some things are better left alone. Now the words sounded like a warning, not advice. She folded the photo carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, deciding that tomorrow she would confront him again. No more silence, no more guessing. She needed the truth, no matter what it cost her. A gust of wind rattled the window, and she looked outside. The diner below sat quiet, its neon sign flickering faintly in the dark. For years it had been her sanctuary, the only place that felt like home. Now it felt like a stranger's house, full of shadows and secrets. She turned away from the glass and reached for her locket. Her thumb pressed against the letter carved into its back until her skin hurt. "Rose," she whispered, testing the name again, the syllable soft but powerful on her tongue. Something inside her stirred, something deep and instinctive, like a part of her had been waiting all her life to wake. She placed the locket beside the photograph, and for the first time she understood that the story she had believed about her life might never have been real. The truth was coming, and she could feel it closing in. The next morning arrived heavy with fog, the kind that blurred the edges of everything and made the world feel uncertain. Clara barely tasted her breakfast, her thoughts tangled between fear and resolve. She walked to the diner earlier than usual, her steps slow, her hand in her pocket feeling the folded photograph like a heartbeat against her palm. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and the familiar scent of coffee and toast wrapped around her. Mr. Lee was already there, arranging boxes of supplies behind the counter. He looked up when he saw her, his expression tightening before settling into a practiced smile. "You're early again," he said lightly, but his voice carried tension just beneath the surface. "Couldn't sleep," Clara answered, setting her bag down. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photo, placing it on the counter between them. "We need to talk." His gaze dropped to the photograph, and for a brief moment his hands stilled completely. Then he exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a sigh of surrender. "Where did you find that?" he asked, though she could tell he already knew. "In the storage room," she said quietly. "You told me there was nothing there worth looking at." He said nothing, his jaw tightening as he stared at the image of his younger self standing beside the woman who could have been Clara's reflection. "Who is she?" Clara pressed. "Who is Rose?" The question seemed to tear something inside him. His eyes glistened, his shoulders sagging under a weight too heavy to keep carrying. For years he had been the man she leaned on, the one who made her believe she had a place in the world. Now he looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth that might destroy them both. "You should not have gone through those things," he said finally. His voice was rough, trembling at the edges. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then make me understand," Clara said. "I have a right to know." He looked at her for a long time, his silence thick with conflict. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "Her name was Rose," he said softly. "She was kind, beautiful. She worked here with me when we first opened this diner, and she loved you more than anything." The words hit Clara like a blow. Her breath caught, and she stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say he had misspoken. "Loved me?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" Mr. Lee's eyes filled with sorrow. "She was your mother, Clara." The room seemed to tilt around her, the sound of the coffee pot dripping, the faint chatter of morning customers outside, the hum of the lights. All of it faded into a hollow silence. "No," she said faintly, shaking her head. That can't be true. He stepped closer, his face etched with regret. I promised her I would protect you, that I would keep you safe. You were just a baby when everything went wrong. His voice broke, and he turned away, unable to look at her. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The world she thought she knew had cracked open, and inside it lay a truth she could barely face. She picked up the photograph, her fingers trembling, and whispered the name again. Rose. For the first time, it did not sound like a mystery. It sounded like home. Shock rippled through Clara like cold water, numbing her thoughts even as her heart raced in disbelief. The diner, once filled with comfort and routine, now felt foreign, every corner haunted by ghosts of memories she never knew belonged to her. She clutched the photograph tightly, her fingers pressing against the worn paper as if it could anchor her to reality. My mother, she repeated softly, the words tasting strange in her mouth. You're saying Rose was my mother? Mr. Lee stood motionless behind the counter, his eyes heavy with guilt. Yes, he said finally. I promised her I would never tell you. She made me swear. Clara's voice trembled. Why? Why would she want to keep that from me? Mr. Lee rubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping as if the years had finally caught up to him. Because she was afraid, he whispered. Afraid of what would happen to you if the wrong people found out who you were. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with unspoken truths. She moved to one of the booths and sank into the seat, her legs weak. I don't understand, she said. What could possibly be so dangerous about knowing who my mother was? He hesitated before answering. Rose's life was complicated. She loved a man she shouldn't have, someone powerful, someone who hurt her more than you can imagine. His voice broke slightly on the last words. When she found out she was pregnant, she came to me for help. I wanted to protect her, but I was too late. Everything fell apart. Clara stared at him, her throat tightening. What happened to her? The question came out in a whisper, almost too fragile to hear. Mr. Lee's gaze dropped to the floor. She died, he said simply. She wanted you to have a chance at peace, a life free from the danger that followed her. The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara could hear the faint hum of the lights above, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Her hands shook as she looked at the picture again, her mother's smiling face burning into her memory. And you? She asked after a moment. Why didn't you tell me? You watched me grow up here. You saw me wondering about my past. You let me believe I was alone. He flinched at her words, his voice cracking when he finally spoke. Because I made her a promise. And because I was afraid, too. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd hate me. Or worse, you'd go looking for the man who caused all of this. Clara's breath caught. My father. He nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. He doesn't know you're alive. He believed you both died. The words hit her like a blow. The pieces were falling into place, but each one cut deeper than the last. She rose from the booth, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. You should have told me, she said quietly, her voice trembling with grief and anger. You should have trusted me. Mr. Lee reached out a hand, but she stepped back. Clara, please, he said softly. Everything I did was to protect you. Protect me from what? She asked, her eyes glistening. From the truth? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as she turned away and stared out the diner window. The street outside looked unchanged, but nothing in her world was the same anymore. Clara stood frozen, her reflection trembling faintly in the diner's window as the weight of Mr. Lee's confession pressed down on her. Outside, the morning light had grown harsher, washing the world in a pale, unfeeling glow. Inside, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had forgotten how to move forward. She turned back to him slowly, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "So all this time, you knew who I was, you knew who she was, and you just kept it from me." Mr. Lee's lips parted, but no words came. He looked older than she had ever seen him, his shoulders slumped beneath an invisible burden. "Clara," he began softly, "I wanted to tell you so many times. You were so young. You had already lost so much. I thought if I kept you safe, maybe it would all stay buried." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "Buried? You call this safety? You built my whole life on lies." The trembling in her voice turned into anger, her hands gripping the counter to steady herself. Mr. Lee moved closer, but she stepped back, her breath uneven. "Please try to understand," he said gently. "Rose trusted me. She made me swear that your life would not be touched by the pain she endured. I thought I was honoring her. I thought I was keeping her promise alive." Clara's throat tightened. "And what about me? Didn't I deserve to know where I came from? Didn't I deserve the truth?" His eyes glistened. "Yes, you did. But I was a coward. I was afraid of losing you." For a moment, the only sound between them was the low hum of the coffee machine cooling beside the sink. Then Clara exhaled shakily, the anger giving way to grief. "She was my mother," she whispered, "and I never even knew her name until yesterday." Mr. Lee closed his eyes, his voice trembling. "She would have been so proud of you. You are everything she hoped you would be." The sincerity in his tone cut through her pain, but it did not erase it. "You say that," Clara murmured, "but you took away my choice to know her, to love her, to even grieve her." Her voice cracked on the last word. "How could you decide that for me?" He reached out again, his hand shaking. "Because she asked me to, because I thought it was what she wanted." Clara's chest tightened, the ache spreading like wildfire through her ribs. "And the stranger who came in, he knew her too, didn't he?" Mr. Lee hesitated, then nodded. "Daniel," he said quietly. "He was her brother." The room seemed to tilt again as the revelation hit her. "Her brother," she repeated faintly. "My uncle. He has been looking for you for years," Mr. Lee said, his voice rough. "He found me once before. I begged him to stop searching. I told him you deserved peace." Clara's mind spun, each word another thread unraveling the life she thought she knew. "You lied to him too," she said softly. "You kept me from the only family I had left." Mr. Lee's silence was its own confession. Clara stepped back, the distance between them now filled with everything that had been lost. Her eyes were wet, her heart raw, but her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "You might have kept your promise to her, but you broke it with me." Mr. Lee looked at her then, the truth heavy in his expression. "I know," he whispered, "and I will carry that for the rest of my life." The words landed softly, without defense, but they brought no comfort. Clara turned toward the door, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hand, and for the first time since she started working at the diner, she no longer felt like she belonged there. Clara walked out of the diner without looking back. The photograph crumpled in her hand, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the quiet street. The air outside was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Her thoughts spun wildly, the weight of every word Mr. Lee had spoken pressing against her chest until it was hard to breathe. She had wanted answers for so long, but not like this. Not truths that tore apart the only sense of safety she had ever known. She wandered down the street, past shuttered shops and sleeping houses, her mind full of memories that no longer felt like her own. Every act of kindness from Mr. Lee now felt tangled with betrayal. Every warm smile, every fatherly word, every time he had called her kiddo, replayed in her mind, now colored by the truth that he had never just been a kind employer. He had been her guardian, her mother's keeper, the last gate between her and a life built on secrets. She stopped at the small park on the corner, sitting on the worn wooden bench where she used to eat her lunch on quiet afternoons. The world looked the same, but everything inside her had shifted. She pulled the photograph from her pocket, smoothing out the wrinkles with trembling fingers. The woman's smile still held that same quiet grace, and for a moment, Clara imagined what it might have been like to grow up with her, to hear her laugh, to know the sound of her voice, to feel what it was like to be loved by her mother. The ache that filled her chest was sharp and endless. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered into the still air. But even as the words left her lips, she knew the answer wasn't simple. Rose hadn't left her. She had been taken away by circumstance, by fear, by choices that were never hers to make. The tears that fell were silent, hot trails cutting through the numbness that had taken over since morning. When her breathing finally slowed, another thought began to take root, fragile but certain. Mr. Lee had said her father was powerful, dangerous, a man who had believed she was dead. If that was true, then she had to know who he was, not because she wanted revenge, but because she needed the truth that Rose had died protecting. She rose from the bench slowly, determination tightening in her chest, where grief had lived only moments before. She wiped her tears and looked up at the fading afternoon sky. Somewhere out there was the other half of her story, the part that could finally make sense of all the pain and secrecy, and she knew she couldn't rely on Mr. Lee to give it to her. He had carried his share of guilt, but she couldn't stay in his shadow anymore. She would find her father. She would find out why her mother had feared him, and why her life had been hidden behind lies. As she walked back toward the diner to collect her things, she caught sight of Mr. Lee standing at the window, his face pale, his eyes full of remorse. For a moment their gazes met through the glass. Neither of them spoke, but the look they shared said everything. She was no longer the girl who needed his protection. She was the woman who would uncover the truth. Clara returned to the diner that evening, the air heavy with the weight of everything unspoken between them. Mr. Lee was still there, sitting in the same booth where she had left him hours earlier, his hands folded on the table as if in prayer. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. For a moment she stood by the door, unsure if she wanted to walk away or demand the rest of the truth. He looked up when he heard the bell above the door, his eyes red and tired. "You came back," he said softly, his voice brittle. Clara stepped forward slowly, the photograph still clutched in her hand. "I need to know who he is," she said quietly. "My father. You said he was powerful, that he believed I was dead. Tell me his name." Mr. Lee's shoulders tensed, and his gaze dropped to the table. "Clara, please," he said, his voice cracking. You don't need to go looking for him. That man brings nothing but pain." She shook her head, her tone firm. "Pain doesn't scare me anymore. Lies do. You've kept me in the dark my whole life, and I can't live like that another day." He hesitated, then stood slowly, his every movement weighted with regret. "His name is Charles Whitmore," he said finally. "He owns half the businesses in this town, including this diner." The words hit her like a wave. "He owns this place?" she whispered. Mr. Lee nodded. "He invested in it years ago, when your mother was still alive. They met because of this diner. She was working here part-time. He was already married." Clara felt her breath catch, her mind racing to keep up. So he had a family, a whole other life. Mr. Lee's expression was full of sorrow. "Yes, and when Rose told him about you, he panicked. He tried to make it right at first, but his wife found out, and everything fell apart. Rose was driven away. I helped her disappear before he could take you from her." Clara's voice trembled. "And she died before he ever knew I survived." "He believes you both were lost in that fire," Mr. Lee said quietly. "He never looked again. Or maybe he didn't want to. I thought keeping you hidden was the only way to protect you from him and from the people around him who would not have forgiven what he did." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "All this time, I've been serving his customers, living above his diner, living in the shadow of the man who destroyed my mother." Mr. Lee stepped closer, but she did not move. "I wanted you to have peace," he said softly. "I didn't want his name to poison your life the way it poisoned hers." She looked at him, her voice low but steady. "You say you did it to protect me, but all you did was build my cage out of kindness." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know," he whispered, "and I will never forgive myself for it." Clara took a step back, her pulse quickening. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to hear the truth from his mouth." Mr. Lee's voice broke into a whisper. "If you do this, there is no going back." She met his gaze, her eyes bright with determination. "There's no going back anyway." The diner fell into silence again as she turned toward the door. The neon sign flickered above her, its soft light painting the room in gold and pink. She paused only once, glancing over her shoulder at the man who had raised her in lies but loved her like a daughter. Then she stepped out into the night, ready to face the man whose blood she carried and the truth that had waited far too long to be told. The following morning arrived with a pale, uncertain light that barely touched the quiet streets. Clara stood outside the gates of the Whitmore estate, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The mansion loomed before her, its tall iron fence lined with trimmed hedges and old stone pillars that seemed to watch her like sentinels. She hesitated, clutching the photo in her pocket as if it were armor. Every step she had taken since leaving the diner had felt unreal, like walking into someone else's dream. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain, and for a moment she considered turning back. But then she remembered her mother's name written on the back of that photograph, the quiet strength in her smile, and the ache of all the years she had lived without knowing why. She could not stop now. The gates were closed, but a small side entrance stood open. She slipped through it quietly, her footsteps muffled on the gravel path. The grounds were immaculate, rows of roses and ivy climbing the stone walls. The house itself was grand, its windows tall and gleaming, reflecting the morning light like glassy eyes. She approached the front door, her palms damp with nerves, and pressed the bell. The chime that followed echoed faintly through the house. A few moments later, a woman in a crisp uniform opened the door, her expression polite but distant. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Clara swallowed hard. "I'm here to see Charles Whitmore," she said. The woman frowned slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "But please, tell him it's important." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded and disappeared inside, leaving Clara standing in the vast foyer's doorway. Her eyes swept over the marble floor, the paintings, the sweeping staircase that seemed to climb into another world. She had never seen such wealth up close, and yet something about it felt cold, almost sterile, like beauty built on emptiness. A few minutes later, the woman returned and gestured for her to follow. Clara's heart pounded as she walked through the hall, her shoes echoing softly. The woman stopped outside a large oak door and knocked once before opening it. "Mr. Whitmore will see you now," she said. Clara stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. The man seated behind the desk was older than she expected, his silver hair neatly combed, his face lined but strong. He looked up from a stack of papers, his expression curious but calm. "Yes?" he asked. "Can I help you?" Clara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For a long moment, she could only stare. There was something familiar in the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the way he held himself with quiet authority. "Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "my name is Clara." He gave a polite nod. "All right? What brings you here, Miss Clara?" She took a shaky breath and reached into her pocket. The photograph trembled in her hands as she placed it on his desk. "I think you knew my mother," she said softly. "Her name was Rose." The name seemed to freeze the air in the room. His eyes fell to the photograph, and for a brief second, all color drained from his face. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the worn paper as if it burned to the touch. When he looked up again, the composure was gone from his expression. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Clara met his gaze, her voice steady now. "From the man who raised me." The silence that followed was deafening. He stared at her for what felt like forever, his lips parting as recognition dawned in his eyes. "You," he breathed. "It can't be." But the way his hands trembled said he already knew the truth. Charles Whitmore stared at Clara as if she were a ghost, his eyes wide, his mouth parted in stunned disbelief. But beneath the surface of his silence was a storm that had clearly waited years to rise. The photograph trembled slightly in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out hoarse, stripped of the polished tone he had used moments earlier. "This was taken before she left," he said slowly, almost to himself, "before everything fell apart." Clara didn't move, didn't blink. "She didn't leave," she said gently. "She was driven away." His eyes snapped up to hers, filled with something between guilt and grief. "You're her daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara gave the smallest nod. "Yes. I was born after she disappeared. I was raised by someone who worked with her." He said, "You thought we both died." Charles stood, pacing away from the desk, his hand dragging through his hair as he tried to process what was unfolding before him. "I thought the fire was real," he said, almost in a whisper. "There was no trace. I searched, but I was told there were no survivors. I thought I lost both of you." His voice broke on the last word. Clara watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "Then why didn't you keep searching?" she asked. "If you loved her, if you knew she was pregnant, why didn't you try harder?" He turned to her then, and for the first time she saw the man behind the name. Not the powerful businessman, not the figure from someone else's story. Just a father who had failed and buried that truth deep inside. "Because I was a coward," he said plainly. "My wife found out about Rose. She threatened to destroy everything. She hated her. She hated the idea of you. I let fear decide for me. And then when they told me you were gone, I accepted it because it was easier than facing what I had done." Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You chose comfort over us." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and I have regretted it every single day." She studied his face, searching for the lie, but found only the weight of years. "I didn't come here for apologies," she said. "I came because I needed to know the truth, about who I am, about who she was." His voice softened. "Rose was the best part of my life. She was kind, strong, smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She believed in people, even when they didn't deserve it." He looked at her, his eyes now wet. "You have her eyes." The words sent a sharp ache through her chest. She had heard that before, from Mr. Lee, but now it meant something different, deeper. She glanced down at the photograph still on the desk. "She died, thinking you abandoned her," she said quietly. "She died, alone." He turned away, and for a long moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was raw. "Then I have to live with that." The room fell into silence again, heavy with everything they had just unearthed. Clara didn't know what she had expected. Maybe anger, maybe denial, but not this broken man whose past had caught up to him in the form of a daughter he had never met. She stepped toward the desk, picked up the photograph, and tucked it back into her coat. "I just needed to know," she said. "Now I do." As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice barely more than a breath. "Clara." She paused, but didn't look back. "I know I don't deserve to ask," he said, "but if there's ever a time when you want to know more about me, about your family, I'll be here." She said nothing, and the silence that followed held more than words ever could. Then she stepped out into the crisp morning air, the heavy gates closing quietly behind her. Clara walked away from the estate with slow, measured steps, each one echoing with everything she had just heard and everything she could not unhear. The street ahead was empty, the wind carrying a faint scent of pine and something colder, something like finality. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because the numbness had settled too deeply for tears. The truth had arrived like a storm, loud and sudden, and now the silence that followed felt even heavier. Charles Whitmore had been exactly what she feared, and yet not what she expected. He hadn't denied her, he hadn't lied, he hadn't tried to push her away. He had simply stood in the ruins of his past, admitting the cowardice that had defined his choices and mourning the woman they had both lost. Clara's thoughts drifted back to her mother's face in the photograph, to the soft curve of her smile, the way her eyes had seemed to hold quiet hope. Rose had trusted the wrong man. Then she had trusted the right one and asked him to hide her child from the world, and Clara had paid the price for all of it. Years of not knowing, years of feeling like a puzzle missing its center, and now that she had the missing piece, it didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity, a sharp, cutting kind. As she reached the diner, the familiar neon flickered above her like a pulse. She hesitated outside, staring at the place where her life had unfolded in gentle routine, the place that had been a shelter and a lie all at once. Inside, Mr. Lee was wiping down a table, his movements slow and distracted. When he saw her through the window, he stopped. Their eyes met, and she could see the question waiting in his. She opened the door quietly, stepping into the space that suddenly felt too small for the weight she carried. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching her, waiting for what she would say. "I met him," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the tired edge of someone who had walked through fire. Mr. Lee nodded once. "I figured you would." Clara sat down at the counter, placing the photo between them. He didn't deny anything. He remembered her. He remembered me. Mr. Lee leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Did he tell you the truth?" "Yes," she replied. "He told me everything, including what he didn't do, how he let fear decide for him, how he convinced himself we were gone." Mr. Lee's expression tightened, a mixture of regret and something deeper. "And now?" he asked. "What do you want to do with what you know?" Clara looked down at the worn edges of the photograph, her thumb brushing gently over her mother's smile. "I don't know," she whispered. "Part of me wants to forget it all, pretend none of this happened. But another part of me feels like I've finally started breathing for the first time." He nodded slowly, then said in a voice low with emotion, "You have always deserved the truth. I'm sorry I waited so long to give it to you." Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the counter and took his hand. "I can't forget what you kept from me," she said. "But I do know you loved her, and you tried to love me the only way you knew how." His eyes shimmered with tears he didn't let fall. "You were the only piece of her I had left. I didn't want to break you with the truth." "But hiding it broke me anyway," she said gently. He nodded again. No defense, no excuses. Just silence and understanding. The kind that comes too late but still matters. Later that evening, the diner was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of closing hours, and Clara sat at her usual booth near the window, the same one where she had poured coffee and smiled through 1,000 ordinary days that now felt like echoes from another life. Mr. Lee stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel, though there was nothing left to clean. They had barely spoken since she returned. Words felt too heavy, and silence, for once, did not feel like avoidance. It felt like respect. Clara turned the photograph over in her hands again, not because she needed to see it, but because touching it grounded her. Her mother's face was now more than just an image. It was a presence, a truth that had survived silence, distance, fear, and time. She looked up at Mr. Lee, her voice quiet but firm. "Will you tell me about her?" He paused, eyes searching hers, then nodded and walked over to the booth, sitting across from her with a sigh that came from somewhere deep. "She was stubborn," he said with a small smile. "Smart as hell, too good at reading people. She could slice through someone's mask with one look." Clara smiled faintly, feeling a flicker of warmth in her chest. "Sounds familiar." He chuckled, then his face softened with something tender. "She was terrified when she found out she was pregnant, but not for herself. She was afraid for you. She didn't want her child growing up in shadows, in a lie. But the truth would have destroyed her, and maybe you." Clara nodded slowly. "But it did anyway, just over a longer stretch of time." Mr. Lee didn't argue. He looked down at his hands, weathered and strong, then back at her. I kept you close because I didn't know what else to do. You were all I had left of her, and even though I failed her by lying, I wanted to honor her in the only way I could, by keeping you safe." Clara felt the tears rise but didn't let them fall. She had cried enough in the last few days to fill an ocean. "You did give me a life," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. I don't hate you, Mr. Lee, but I need time to forgive you." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I'll wait as long as you need." For a while, they sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside the only things filling the space. Clara leaned back, her gaze drifting across the diner. It looked exactly the same, yet everything inside her had changed. She no longer belonged to the story of the girl who served pie and wiped counters with no past. She was Rose's daughter, Charles's daughter, a girl born from love and fear and silence. She looked at Mr. Lee and saw not just the man who had lied, but the man who had tried, who had carried the weight of another's legacy and broken under the burden. "I don't know where I go from here," she said quietly. "You start by breathing," he replied. "Then you decide what story you want to tell next." She gave a small nod and turned back to the window, the neon sign reflecting faintly in the glass. The world outside hadn't changed, but she had, and that was enough for now. The next morning, Clara arrived at the diner just as the first light stretched across the pavement, soft and golden, the way it always did before the town stirred to life. She unlocked the front door with a familiar twist of the wrist, the bell above her head chiming the same greeting it had for years, but everything inside felt different. The chairs were still turned up on the tables, the coffee machine still waited for its first brew, the same faint scent of sugar and floor polish hung in the air. Yet, as she moved through the space, each step felt like a farewell. She didn't need to be told this chapter was over. She could feel it in her bones, quiet and certain. She walked slowly behind the counter, brushing her fingers along the edge, where she used to lean during slow mornings, where she had written notes to herself, where she had waited for answers that never came. Her reflection in the napkin holder stared back, softer now, but stronger too. She poured herself a cup of coffee, not out of habit, but out of ritual, needing one last taste of the world she had lived in for so long. She sat in her favorite booth, staring out at the street as it began to wake. People passed with sleepy eyes and grocery bags, never guessing that the girl in the window was someone new now. Mr. Lee arrived not long after, surprised to see her already there. He paused in the doorway, uncertainty written in his posture. "You're early," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "One last morning." He nodded, saying nothing more, and walked behind the counter, starting the tasks he had done for decades. They moved in quiet harmony, no instructions needed, no explanation required. When the sun had fully risen and the morning rush began to flicker through the window, Clara untied her apron and folded it neatly on the counter. Mr. Lee watched her, his eyes filled with questions he didn't ask. "I need to go," she said simply. "I don't know where yet, but I need to find out who I am outside of this place." He stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. "You will always have a home here, even if you never come back." She nodded, grateful but certain. "Thank you for what you gave me and for what you finally let go." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you," he said. It's something she wrote. Rose. I've kept it all this time. Clara took it slowly, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't open it. Not yet. Some things deserved quiet. Some things needed space. She placed it gently inside her coat, then turned toward the door. As she reached it, she looked back once more. The booths, the counter, the clock, the man who had been a father in his own flawed way, all of it seemed wrapped in the warm haze of memory now. She smiled, soft and full of sadness. Then she opened the door, the bell chimed, and she stepped out into the light, leaving behind the only world she had ever known, ready at last to step into the one that was waiting to begin. The morning sun bathed the quiet street in gentle gold as Clara walked away from the diner, the envelope tucked safely inside her coat and her heart heavier than it had ever been, yet somehow steadier too. The town around her stirred to life like it did every day, unaware that something profound had just ended and something even more important had begun. She didn't know where she was going or what she would find when she got there, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of the unknown. The truth, painful as it was, had freed her. The lies were gone now, stripped away by her own courage, and what remained was something she could finally claim as her own. As she walked past familiar storefronts and nodded at strangers she had once served coffee to, she felt the weight of her mother's memory walking beside her. Rose was no longer just a name or a faded photograph. She was real now, a part of Clara that could never be erased. And Charles, for all his mistakes, had given her a piece of her identity that had been missing for so long. The world had not given her a perfect past, but she had fought for the truth and earned something stronger than comfort. She had earned herself. She reached the edge of town just as the wind picked up, rustling the trees and filling the air with the scent of leaves and morning dew. She stopped at a small overlook that faced the hills, the same spot she had visited on quiet nights when she needed space to breathe. She pulled the envelope from her coat, her fingers trembling, and opened it slowly. Inside was a single page, her mother's handwriting delicate but firm. "My sweet girl," it began, "if you're reading this, then I am no longer with you. But please know, not a day passed where I did not love you with my whole heart. I wanted to protect you. I wanted to give you a better life than the one I could have offered. If you've found this, it means the truth has found you too. I hope it did not break you. I hope it gave you back your name. You are not lost. You never were. You are mine. Always." Clara held the letter to her chest, her eyes closed, the tears falling freely now, not out of pain, but release. She stood there for a long time, letting the words settle deep into her bones. Then she folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope. The wind lifted her hair as she turned from the hills and walked down the path that led away from everything she had ever known. She didn't look back this time. The diner, the silence, the secrets, they would live in memory, but they would no longer define her. Her story was hers to write now, not shaped by lies, but by choice. And as the sun climbed higher and her shadow stretched forward, Clara stepped fully into the light, ready at last to begin the life that had waited so long for her to claim. If this story moved you or made you reflect on the quiet strength hidden in everyday people, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps us bring more heartfelt journeys like this to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. And if you know someone searching for answers, remind them that sometimes the truth we need most is waiting in the places we least expect, in a stranger's eyes, in an old photo, or in the courage to finally ask why. Thank you for watching.